A few things here in conclusion regarding depth of field. To follow the tips and rule of thumb that we've just discussed, does this mean that we should always use maximum aperture if we want the greatest depth of field? Well, sounds logical, but there's a lot of things that go into play. Actually, one thing to think about, there's diffraction that comes into play when the aperture is too small. And this actually might affect the quality of the image, given the appearance that some objects that have a lot of light are not in focus. So just because we play with aperture doesn't mean it's going to be perfect. We know, f6 to f8 are usually the best aperture settings to use for maximum depth of field on 35 millimeter cameras. I showed you some examples of an f6 aperture that had not that wide, not that large of a depth of field. So it's all about playing with it. Now we do have some ways we can post-process our photos to achieve what's called a pseudo depth of field. Some people do this. Some people use this post-processing and apply a Gaussian blur to their background to achieve that blurred background effect. However, it's not the way you want to do it. To a trained eye, this is most always apparent and it looks false. It doesn't look right. So be cautious with that. For this exercise, I do not want anybody to go into Photoshop and use a Gaussian blur. We can also increase the depth of field or appearance of it by using a small aperture, moving away from our subject, or using a wide angle lens. So we can decrease the depth of field or the appearance of it by using a large aperture, moving closer to our subject, or using a long focal length. So to increase the depth of field, small aperture, move away from the subject, or use a wide angle lens. To decrease the depth of field, a small depth of field, large aperture, move closer to your subject, or use a long focal lens. Now, tripods. We've talked about this, giving you a few tips. It is absolutely necessary for images where you need increased depth of field. So to render a scene with great detail in focus from foreground to background, you need to what we call stop down the lens and use a smaller aperture. The smaller aperture produces a slower shutter speed, which makes it really tricky when you're just trying to hand hold it. So that might be why you never can get a really great landscape photo in focus. Because the smaller aperture, less light's coming in, so we need a slower shutter speed to allow the light to come in, which makes for any kind of jiggles and bumps to be shown in your photo. Depth of field is one of the most effective ways to direct the viewer's attention in a photo. I really enjoy fun tricks on depth of field. One thing I did mention was the aperture priority mode. We mentioned that about shooting through the fence and how you can put your camera, if it's available, to that mode. What aperture priority mode does, it's a kind of a semi-automatic mode, and it relies on you to decide the aperture, and then the camera will supply the appropriate shutter speed. So in many of those photos actually that I showed you at the zoo, I was in aperture priority because the shutter speed was changing a bit, and that was the camera doing that for me. So in conclusion, we've talked about depth of field, some of the sources where I pulled some of this information from. This is something that really you need to practice to understand. You can go online and read a lot of great resources out there, but you really need to get your hands on the camera and go out and practice.